Will the real Night Stalker please stand up? Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was more than just another serial killer. He also enjoyed housebreaking and raping. He was active between 1984 and 1985, injecting fear into the residents of Los Angeles. His MO was fairly routine, only going off script when the situation dictates him to. Which includes rape, assault and murder, usually while they sleep. Join me as we explore the life and crimes of Richard Ramirez. Welcome to Simply Told. Richard was born in El Paso, Texas on the 29th of February 1960, to lucky, or should I say unlucky parents, Mercedes and Julian Ramirez. Now Richard had this cousin named Mike. And Mike, who was a former military guy, becomes a role model to Richard. Their bond solidified years earlier when Richard bears witness to a murder. The day Mike fatally shoots his wife in the face. That event doesn't affect Richard. But it sure does fascinate him. And over time Mike candidly shares graphic and at times perverse tales with Richard. Now with this sort of stimulation, add to that his violent temper. I'm beginning to understand why Richard inevitably lost the plot. The Night Stalker. The 28th of June 1984. In an apartment in Glassell Park, Los Angeles, the body of an elderly woman, Jenny Vincow, was found. She had her throat slit and repeatedly stabbed. With many of stab wounds directed mostly to her chest, neck and face area, while she lay asleep. A fingerprint was found on a mesh screen he removed to gain access through an open window. The 17th of March 1985. Richard attacks 22-year-old Maria Hernandez, who lived in Rosemead, California, as she turns into her driveway and proceeds to drive her car into the garage. Then a gunshot is heard, with the bullet hitting Maria in the face. But through some miracle, Maria survives the attack, as she instinctively raises her hands to protect her face. The bullet luckily ricocheted off her keys she was holding in her hand at the time. Still alive, Maria plays dead, in the hopes that Richard wouldn't shoot her again. Satisfied that she was dead, Richard heads inside the home. Her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Yoshi Okazaki, hears the shot and hides behind some furniture. As she raises her head to see what was going on, Richard fatally shoots Dale in the head. After the robbery, in Monterey Park, a 30-year-old Veronica Yu was forced out of her car and shot in the face. She died on the way to the hospital. The two murders and one attempted murder attracts attention, gaining extensive media coverage. The 27th of April 1985, in Whittier, California. Richard enters the home of Vincent and Maxine Zazzara. He shoots the 64-year-old Vincent in the head, fatally wounding him. His 44-year-old wife, Maxine Lavinia Zazzara, wakes up after hearing the gunshot. She was violently beaten, then bound. While Richard was rummaging through their belongings, Maxine works herself free and grabs a shotgun that lay hidden under their bed. But she soon finds out the hard way that her gun wasn't loaded. Now angry by her actions, Richard shoots Maxine multiple times. He grabs a knife from the kitchen and stabs her numerous more times. He removes her eyes, placing them in a jewelry box, which he takes with him, keeping them as a souvenir. Their bodies are later found by their son, Peter. Photographs was taken of a shoe print that was found in the flower beds. This was virtually the only evidence the police had at the time. Bullets from this crime scene was matched to bullets from previous crimes. The evidence reveals to the police that they were dealing with a serial killer. On May 14, 1985, in Monterey Park, Richard enters the home of 66-year-old Bill Doy, and his disabled 56-year-old wife, Lillian. As Richard enters the bedroom, he surprises Bill. Before Bill has a chance to reach for his firearm, Richard shoots him in the face. Bill was still alive, so Richard knocks him out. Richard ties up Lillian, rapes her, before rummaging through the house for valuables. Bill would later die from his injuries. The 29th of May 1985, Richard, driving a stolen car, pulls up at the home of 83-year-old Mabel Bell, who lived with her 81-year-old sister, Florence Lang. After entering their home, Richard comes across a hammer and takes it along. He knocks him out. He then shocks Mabel with an electrical cord. Florence and Mabel are found a few days later. They were alive, but barely. Mabel would later die of her injuries. The following day Richard pulls up at the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. He ties her and her 11-year-old son up, while at gunpoint. He ransacks their home afterwards. He returns to Carol. He unties her, before repeatedly raping her. He handcuffs them both, before making his getaway. The night of the 2nd of July 1985, Richard, still driving the stolen car, finds himself in Arcadia. Cruising the streets. Searching for the next target. He chooses the home of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon. Richard finds Mary sleeping in her bed. He grabs the lamp and knocks her out, finally stabbing her to death with a knife he found in her kitchen. The 5th of July 1985, Richard, now in Sierra Madre, bludgeons 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a wheel brace, while she was still asleep. Richard then strangles her with a cord. He claims that she suddenly starts to breathe, and opens her eyes. At that very moment, sparks could be seen shooting from around her neck. Believing that the hand of God was at work, Richard runs scared. Whitney survives the attack, but not before receiving close to 500 stitches, to close up her head wound. The 7th of July 1985, Richard heads for Monterey Park, and enters the home of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson. He finds her asleep in the living room. Richard kills her by repeatedly stomping on her face, leaving a unique footprint impression, imprinted on her face. The footprint was later confirmed to come from unique pair of shoes, Avia sneakers. Still in Monterey Park, Richard gains entry to the home of 63-year-old Sophie Dickman. Richard confronts Sophie and points his gun at her. And as before, he ties her up before rummaging through her valuables. The 20th of July 1985, Richard heads towards Glendale, California. Now sporting a machete, he enters the home of 68-year-old Maxon and his 66-year-old wife, Leila Needing. He burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom and starts hacking away, finally ending the torture, by shooting them both in the head. He then rummaged through their home for their valuables. Richard was now heading for Sun Valley, and breaks into the home of the Covenant family. He kills Chanaron Kovananth by shooting him in the head. He turns to focus on Somkid Kovananth. Richard repeatedly rapes her, before running off with their valuables. The 6th of August 1985, Richard breaks into the Northridge home of Chris and Virginia Peterson. He enters the bedroom, waking Virginia in the process. Richard quickly remedies the problem by shooting her in the face. Chris was shot in the neck but still has the strength to tackle the gun away from Richard. Richard breaks free and gets away. The couple would miraculously survive the attack. In the early hours of the 8th of August 1985, Richard breaks into the California home of 31-year-old Elias Abawath, and his wife, 27-year-old Sakina Abawath. After finding Elias, Richard fatally shoots him in the head. He ties the couple's 3-year-old son, before he repeatedly rapes Sakina. After taking what he deems valuable, Richard exits, leaving the mother and son alive, but tied up in the house. Her son is freed, and runs for help. The 18th of August 1985, Richard was now roaming the streets of San Francisco. After finding his target home, 66-year-old Peter and 62-year-old Barbara Pan, Richard fatally shoots Peter while he was asleep. He then assaults Barbara, finally shooting her in the head, leaving yet another clue for the police to discover: his shoe print from his Avia sneakers he wore. Detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo followed up obtaining any helpful information regarding these shoes. According to the manufacturer, 6 pairs of shoes, size 11, was shipped to the States, with Arizona receiving the bulk of the order, with the final pair sent to Los Angeles. It was evident that the pair sent to California was the pair the police was targeting. As it was an ongoing investigation, police was holding back crucial information from the media, fearing the criminal could get rid of the evidence. But then San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein leaks the information to the press anyway, revealing the gun type used, also mentions the shoe prints found at the scene of the crime. After the broadcast, Richard dumps his sneakers over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge. The 24th of August 1985. Richard was scouting the roads of Mission Viejo, choosing the home of Romero family. A 13-year-old James Romero Jr. was still up, while the rest of the family was asleep. Jr. was in the garage working on his mini bike when he hears a rustling noise outside. It was loud enough to make him investigate. After a quick look he sees and finds nothing of interest. He heads back to work on his bike. But again he hears something outside. Now looking out through the window, Junior notices someone on the property. Thinking it's a burglar, he makes his way back into their home, and wakes his dad. Richard noticed activity in the house, and decides to retreat. Junior makes it outside just as Richard pulls away. He takes note of the make and model of the car, even remembers part of the license plate number. James Sr. reports the crime and hands the police the description of the car, explaining to the police he believes that the intruder was simply looking for an easy score. After this failed attempt, Richard decides to scout for his next target, and finds one. He enters the bedroom of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his 29-year-old fiancée, Inez Erickson. The sound of Richard cocking his gun wakes Bill. As he opens his eyes, he's shot 3 times in the head. He ties Inez's hands, while he physically assaults her. He raids the house searching for valuables, returning to Inez afterwards, to rape her. Just before leaving, Richard hints to Inez, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Inez finally works herself free, and runs for help. Bill was alive when the medical response arrived. Surgeons could only remove 2 of the 3 bullets lodged in Bill's head. But Bill gives Richard the middle finger, and survives. The police kept collecting evidence throughout the Night Stalker's reign of terror. Some of the evidence gathered includes: the police receives a detailed description of the Night Stalker from a survivor, a cast of the shoe print found at some of the crime scenes. The stolen car used by Richard was later found abandoned in Koreatown. A fingerprint found on the rear view mirror of the stolen car matched Richard Ramirez. On the 29th of August 1985, Richard's mugshot was released to the media. Finally, the Night Stalker has a face. With the police releasing this statement, quote, "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." End quote. The 30th of August 1985, Richard was unaware that the world knew his identity. He planned on catching a bus to Tucson, Arizona that day, to visit his brother. But when he gets there, his brother's not home. Richard has no choice but to head home. Arriving back in Los Angeles in the early hours of the 31st of August 1985. Richard was still unaware the police released his mugshot to media. He casually walks past a few officers, who ironically was looking out for someone fitting his description. But then he hears, "El Matador." In Spanish, that means, the killer. A group of women sees Richard, and identifies him as the killer. Richard's only realistic option was to run. Accidentally glances the front page of the newspaper as he turns to run away, and sees his face staring back at him. With the header reading, "Night Invader." But some of the public gives chase. He attempts to steal a car, but was dragged out of the car by an angry resident. He gets away and runs into another woman, where he attempts to snatch her car keys from her hands. But her husband spots his wife's in trouble. Richard flees, but the woman's husband gives chase. The angry mob eventually captures Richard. When the police eventually arrived, they find Richard Ramirez beaten and bruised. They quickly take him into custody before the now 700-strong crowd of angry residents gets a second wind. Trial and conviction. The 20th of September, 1989. Richard was convicted on 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The 7th of November 1989. Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. After his verdict was read out, Richard responds to a reporter, saying, quote, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." End quote. Anyway, so woman was literally throwing themselves at his feet. He had tons of fans, writing to him, with some even visiting him in prison. And then there's Doreen Lyoy. She was Richard's main squeeze. They later get married in California's San Quentin State Pen. Even before her wedding to Richard, Doreen vows to take her own life when Richard is to be executed. But that day never comes. Doreen walks away from the marriage, and by extension, Richard, after DNA found on 9-year-old Mei Liang, was a match to Richard's DNA. On April 10, 1984, Ramirez murdered Mei Liang, a 9-year-old Chinese-American girl, in the basement of his apartment building in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Mei Liang was out searching for lost money. Richard spots the girl and walks towards her, suggesting afterwards to come search the basement. When Richard has Mei alone in the basement, he grabs the little girl and beats her. He then rapes her before pulling out a knife, and stabs her to death. He displays his work by hanging the half-nude girl from a pole, by her clothes. Finally, on the 7th of June 2013, Richard dies at Marin General Hospital, in California. And that's how Richard's story ends. Thanks to the Hauer family for the support. Hope you enjoyed this week's content contribution. If yes, then please feel free to show just how much with a like, share, subscribe. Any of those gestures would really help grow the channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode of Simply Told.